A geophysicist stands at the edge of an underwater excavation site in the Chicxulub crater. The year is 2214. His name is Michael Altman. Through the reinforced glass of his diving suit, he can see something that should not exist. A massive obelisk, black as deep space, covered in markings that seem to shift when you stare at them too long. The research team calls it the Black Marker. Altman calls it the worst thing humanity has ever found, but here's what makes this moment unbearable. Altman already knows what this object does. He has seen the visions, he has watched his colleagues tear each other apart in the corridors above. He has heard the whispers promising eternal life, while showing him images of flesh twisting into shapes that violate every principle of biology he spent years studying. And he knows that when he surfaces from this dive, when he tries to warn the world about what lies buried beneath the seafloor, the government will kill him and turn his death into the foundation of a religion that worships the very thing he died trying to stop. This is how Dead Space begins. Not with the Ishimura, not with Isaac Clarke stumbling through darkened corridors with a plasma cutter and failing lights. The real beginning happens 200 years earlier, with a man who sees the trap closing and walks into it anyway because the alternative is letting the marker's existence remain a secret. Altman's choice sets everything in motion. His murder becomes martyrdom, his warnings become gospel, and the object he tried to destroy becomes the sacred relic of a faith that will spread across every human colony in explored space. What follows is not a story about answers. Dead Space is a franchise built on mysteries that the lore actively refuses to resolve. Some of these mysteries have no canonical explanation. Others have contradictory explanations that change depending on which game or novel you reference. And a few exist in a space where the franchise seems to be asking you to notice that certain questions cannot have answers, that cosmic horror requires silence where human minds demand meaning. This analysis explores the major unsolved mysteries of Dead Space, the technical questions about how markers function, the behavioral contradictions in how the necromorph threat operates, the historical gaps in what happened on Tau Volantis, the philosophical problem of what the Brethren Moons actually want, and whether they even have wants in any sense humans would recognize. By the end, you will understand what the franchise is actually about. Beneath all the dismemberment and jump scares, you will see the pattern connecting disparate plot threads, and you will recognize why some horror is more effective when it refuses to explain itself. Before we go further, I want to hear from you. If something in this analysis resonates, if a detail stands out, drop a comment and let me know which part landed for you. You can also suggest topics for future deep dives. So now let's get comfortable, turn down the lights, and let's start. Chapter 1. The Signal That Nobody Understands. The marker sits at the center of everything that goes wrong in Dead Space. Every outbreak traces back to these double helix obelisks. Every necromorph infection requires their presence or proximity. Every instance of convergence needs a marker to coordinate the biomass reorganization. But here is the first major mystery that the franchise never adequately explains. Nobody actually knows how markers work. Markers emit a signal. This signal has multiple functions. It reanimates dead organic tissue and reconfigures it into new forms optimized for hunting and killing. It manipulates living minds, causing hallucinations, suicidal ideation, homicidal compulsion, and in certain individuals, the implantation of blueprints for building more markers. The signal also creates what is called a dead space, a radius around the marker itself where necromorphs cannot enter, where the reanimation effect is suppressed, creating a safe zone that the marker uses to protect individuals it needs alive for its plans. All of this is documented, but nowhere in any Dead Space media does anyone explain the mechanism. How does an obelisk made of inert, non-reactive material generate a signal capable of rewriting biological tissue at the molecular level? The markers are described as being constructed from seemingly ordinary matter. When analyzed, they show no unusual energy signatures when dormant. Yet once activated, they project this signal across planetary distances, affecting every dead cell within range. The scientific team aboard the Ishimura could not explain it. Dr. Kine spent years studying Marker 2A and never determined the source of the signal. EarthGov ran Project Telomere specifically to extract marker knowledge from Isaac Clarke's mind after his exposure on Aegis 7, and even with direct access to someone who had been imprinted with marker blueprints, they still could not replicate the signal's function accurately. They could build red markers, they could activate them, but they could not control what happened next. This is not a case of the franchise withholding information for dramatic effect. This appears to be the lore stating explicitly that human science cannot account for marker functionality. Every attempt to understand the mechanism leads to contradictions. The markers are described as technology, as artifacts built by the Brethren Moons to spread their influence, but they operate in ways that violate known physics. The signal propagates faster than light. It affects consciousness directly without any identified transmission medium. It rewrites genetic code in dead tissue that should not have active biological processes capable of receiving instructions. The closest anyone comes to an explanation appears in documents from Tau Volantis. Dr. Earl Serrano's research notes suggest the marker signal does not just reanimate tissue, it guides biological evolution. The aliens on Tau Volantis were manipulated over generations to develop the intelligence and technology necessary to build red markers. Humans were similarly guided, though on a faster timeline. The signal seems to reach backwards through time, influencing the evolutionary development of species that will eventually encounter it, but this creates more problems than it solves. If the marker signal can guide evolution, it must be able to affect living biology across generational timescales. Yet the signal also causes immediate psychosis and death in most individuals exposed to it. The timeline does not make sense. Species need millions of years to evolve intelligence. The marker signal kills most intelligent beings within days of exposure. How does a mechanism designed to create suitable hosts consistently kill those hosts before they can serve their function? One possibility that the franchise hints at but never confirms: the markers are not technology in any sense humans would recognize. They might be living things. The way they reproduce through imprinted blueprints resembles biological reproduction more than manufacturing. The way the signal adapts to different species and different individuals suggests something closer to predation than broadcast. Markers might be organisms that exist partially outside normal space-time, with the physical obelisk serving as an anchor point that allows them to interact with three-dimensional matter, but this is speculation. The franchise never states this explicitly. What we know for certain is that every faction that tried to weaponize or control marker technology failed catastrophically. EarthGov built red markers thinking they could harness unlimited energy. The markers used them to spread necromorph infections across every colony. The Sovereign Colony's armed forces discovered the alien machine on Tau Volantis and tried to reverse engineer marker suppression technology. The attempt awoke the Brethren Moons. Even the unitologists, who worship the markers and believe convergence is divine, do not actually understand what they are worshipping. They think the markers offer eternal life. The markers offer absorption into a planetary-scale necromorph that will spend eternity consuming other civilizations. The mystery deepens when you look at the differences between black markers and red markers. Black markers are the originals, created by an alien civilization, and launched across space to seed new worlds with the infection. Red markers are human-made copies built from blueprints imprinted by black markers into human minds. But red markers do not function identically to black markers. Marker 3A on Aegis 7, a red marker, created a dead space radius that kept the hive mind trapped beneath the planet's surface. The marker seemed to be suppressing the necromorph threat, rather than encouraging it. Dr. Kine believed returning the marker to its pedestal would stop the outbreak. He was partially correct. Reuniting the marker with its amplification pedestal expanded the dead space radius enough to put the hive mind into dormancy, though the necromorphs elsewhere on the planet remained active. But this behavior contradicts everything we learn about marker intentions in later games. Dead Space 2 reveals that markers want convergence to happen. They need massive necromorph outbreaks to gather enough biomass for a new Brethren Moon to form. If that is the marker's goal, Why did marker 3A on Aegis 7 spend 200 years keeping the hive mind contained? Why did it only allow a small-scale outbreak after it was moved away from its pedestal? The franchise never reconciles this contradiction. Some fan theories suggest that red markers are flawed copies that do not fully understand their own purpose. Others propose that individual markers have different objectives depending on their stage in the convergence cycle. Neither explanation has canonical support. What we are left with is a central technology that behaves inconsistently, that no character fully understands, and that the lore seems designed to keep opaque. This opacity serves a specific purpose. The marker is cosmic horror made physical. It is an object that human intelligence cannot grasp, that resists analysis through any framework humans have developed. Every attempt to study it leads to madness or death. Every theory about its function fails when tested. The marker remains unknowable not because the writers forgot to explain it, but because making it comprehensible would undermine its role as an intrusion from outside human reality. There is something profoundly uncomfortable about technology that works without mechanism, that produces effects without traceable cause. Modern horror often relies on explaining the monster, giving it clear rules and vulnerabilities that allow the protagonist to eventually overcome it. Dead Space refuses this entirely. The marker is not a puzzle to solve. It is a fact of the universe, like gravity or entropy, that simply exists and exerts force regardless of whether anyone understands why. And that brings us to the second mystery, which is deeply connected to the first. If nobody can understand or resist the marker signal, why does Isaac Clarke survive when almost everyone else dies? Why does the marker need him, try to kill him, and fail repeatedly to do either? Chapter 2: The Man Who Couldn't Stay Dead. Isaac Clarke should not have lived past the first hour aboard the Ishimura. He is an engineer, not a soldier. He has no combat training. He arrives on a ship already overrun with necromorphs, watches his team die within minutes, and then spends the next several hours being hunted through corridors by creatures specifically evolved to kill humans efficiently. The statistical probability of his survival approaches 0, yet he survives. He destroys Marker 3A. He escapes Aegis 7, and then he does it again on Titan Station, and again on Tau Volantis. The franchise provides multiple explanations for Isaac's survival, and none of them fully add up. Some logs suggest he has unusual resistance to the marker signal. Others claim he does not resist at all, that he is being manipulated the entire time and only believes he is acting independently. EarthGov deemed him valuable enough for Project Telomere specifically because he could withstand marker exposure that killed or drove insane everyone else with similar levels of intelligence and technical training. But the reason for this resistance is never explained in mechanical terms. One early fan theory suggested Isaac's silence in the first game protected him. The marker signal seemed to work through language, through vocalizing the thoughts it implanted. Since Isaac did not speak in Dead Space 1, perhaps he was immune to the most dangerous aspects of marker influence. This theory collapsed when Dead Space 2 gave Isaac full dialogue, and he remained resistant to the worst effects of the Site-12 marker's influence, though the hallucinations became more severe and complex. The official explanation provided in Dead Space 2 is that Isaac's intelligence made him a more suitable host for marker blueprints. The marker signal affects people based on their cognitive capacity. Low intelligence leads to rapid psychosis and death. High intelligence leads to slower degradation but deeper imprinting. Isaac fell into a narrow range where he was smart enough to receive and retain marker blueprints, but also possessed some psychological trait that allowed him to resist the signal's instructions to build more markers or commit suicide to fuel convergence. But this explanation creates problems. Nolan Strauss was also deemed suitable for Project Telomere. He was a scientist with arguably higher specialized intelligence than Isaac, yet Strauss degraded rapidly, becoming violent and psychotic, eventually trying to murder Isaac and Ellie before being killed. If marker resistance correlates with intelligence, Strauss should have been more resistant than Isaac, not less. The difference might be psychological rather than cognitive. Isaac has a specific trauma that structures his entire experience of the marker signal. Nicole's death. When Isaac first encounters marker 3A's influence, it manifests primarily as hallucinations of Nicole, his girlfriend who died aboard the Ishimura before Isaac arrived. The marker uses Nicole's image to manipulate Isaac, to guide him toward actions the marker needs completed. But because Isaac already knew Nicole was dead, because he spent the first game processing that grief while fighting for survival, he developed a framework for recognizing when the Nicole hallucinations were marker manipulation versus genuine memory. By Dead Space 2, Isaac has learned to identify when the marker is speaking through Nicole's image. He can distinguish real memories from implanted thoughts. This skill is rare. Most people exposed to marker influence cannot separate their own thoughts from marker-generated compulsions. They hear the voice telling them to kill themselves or build markers, and they experience it as their own decision. Isaac hears the same voices but recognizes them as external, as enemy action rather than authentic desire. This explanation works psychologically but still does not address the physical question. How does recognizing manipulation protect against a signal that rewrites brain chemistry? The marker signal is not purely psychological. It causes measurable changes in neural tissue. It can implant complex technical information that the host did not previously possess, as evidenced by Isaac's ability to draw detailed marker schematics after age 7, despite having no prior knowledge of xenoarchaeology or the marker's internal structure. If the signal can physically alter brain structure to insert new information, why does psychological resistance matter? The signal should be able to override conscious resistance through direct neural manipulation unless the marker signal operates through consciousness rather than bypassing it. This would align with the cosmic horror framework. If the marker needs conscious cooperation at some level, if it cannot simply override free will through brute force neural reconfiguration, then Isaac's ability to maintain psychological boundaries would be genuinely protective. The marker could implant thoughts, could create hallucinations, could cause pain and fear, but it could not force Isaac to believe those experiences were his own authentic thoughts without his subconscious cooperation. This reading suggests something deeply uncomfortable about how the marker signal functions. It would mean the marker needs consent, not explicit consent, but the kind of unconscious agreement that happens when someone stops resisting, when they accept the thoughts in their head as their own, rather than questioning their origin. People who succumb to marker influence are not weak-willed. They are people who trust their own thoughts, who do not have reason to doubt that their internal monologue is authentically theirs. The marker exploits this normal cognitive function, inserting thoughts that feel native because the conscious mind has no defense against ideas that arise from what seems like internal reflection. Isaac survives because trauma taught him not to trust his own thoughts. The guilt over Nicole's death, the constant second-guessing of whether he could have saved her if he had responded to her messages differently, created a psychological pattern where Isaac habitually questions his own motivations and decisions. This same pattern that makes him prone to depression and self-blame also makes him resistant to marker influence, because he automatically treats his own thoughts as potentially unreliable. But again, this is interpretation rather than confirmed lore. The franchise never explicitly states this mechanism. What we know for certain is that Isaac survives multiple encounters with markers, that EarthGov considered him uniquely valuable for this resistance, and that the marker signal behaves inconsistently around him compared to other intelligent individuals. The behavioral contradiction becomes clearer when you examine what the marker actually does with Isaac versus what it claims to want. Throughout Dead Space 2, the Site-12 marker uses Nicole hallucinations to guide Isaac toward the marker's location. It tells him to come closer, to make them whole, to end his suffering through convergence. The implication is that the marker wants to absorb Isaac into the convergence event, to use his biomass as part of the necromorph mass forming on Titan Station. But if that was the goal, why did the marker allow Isaac to escape Aegis 7 in the first place? Why did Marker 3A imprint blueprints into Isaac's mind and then let him leave the system? If the marker's purpose is creating convergence events, and Isaac was already present during an active necromorph outbreak with a hive mind ready to absorb him, why didn't the marker ensure his death then? The timeline suggests the marker had other plans. It needed Isaac alive to spread marker knowledge to other systems. The blueprint imprinted in Isaac's mind was not just technical information, it was a replicating signal, a seed that would eventually sprout into more red markers once EarthGov extracted it from Isaac's brain. The marker on Aegis 7 sacrificed its own convergence event to plant knowledge in a vector that would create markers across multiple colonies, multiplying the chances for successful convergence elsewhere. This reading frames Isaac not as someone who defeated the marker, but as someone the marker deliberately released to serve a longer-term strategy. Every time Isaac thinks he is destroying a marker, he is actually fulfilling its purpose by spreading the signal further. His resistance is not resistance at all. It is the marker's manipulation operating at a scale Isaac cannot perceive, except this interpretation also fails to explain certain events. At the end of Dead Space 2, when Isaac confronts the Site-12 marker directly, the marker tries to kill him. It sends the Ubermorph, a regenerating necromorph that cannot be permanently destroyed, to hunt Isaac through the final chapters. It turns the Nicole hallucination hostile, confronting Isaac inside the marker chamber itself as he attempts to destroy it. If the marker needs Isaac alive to spread blueprints, why try to kill him once he has already served that purpose? The most disturbing answer is that the marker was done with him. Once Isaac helped EarthGov build the Site-12 marker by providing the blueprint data, his usefulness ended. The marker switched from preservation to predation, trying to absorb him into convergence like any other biomass. The Nicole hallucination that guides him through most of the game flips to attempting murder in the final moments because the marker's strategy changed. It no longer needed a vector. It needed bodies, but Isaac survives again. He defeats the hallucination in the shuttle. He destroys the Site-12 marker and escapes Titan Station. And the franchise never explains how he managed this when the marker was presumably exerting its full power to kill him. By every established rule, the marker should have been able to overwhelm Isaac's mind completely once he was in direct proximity without any external distractions, yet he fights his way free mentally and physically. This pattern repeats in Dead Space 3. The Tau Volantis moon tries to manipulate Isaac and John Carver against each other, using hallucinations and paranoia to make them fight. It nearly succeeds, but both men eventually recognize the manipulation and work together to destroy the moon despite its influence. Once again, human consciousness proves capable of resisting a force that should be able to overwhelm it. The franchise seems to be arguing that consciousness itself, the ability to recognize your own thoughts as potentially unreliable, is the only defense against the marker signal. This is why most people die quickly. They do not question the voices in their heads. They do not have frameworks for distinguishing authentic thought from implanted compulsion. Isaac survives because his trauma, his guilt, his depression, all created psychological structures that treat internal thoughts as suspicious rather than authoritative. In a strange inversion, mental illness becomes protective. The same rumination and self-doubt that make Isaac miserable also make him resistant to an alien signal that weaponizes trust in your own cognition. This reading would explain why marker exposure causes such severe psychological damage in survivors. The signal does not just attack the mind, it attacks the concept of having a reliable mind, forcing you to question whether any thought is authentically yours. For most people, this uncertainty leads to breakdown. For Isaac, uncertainty was already baseline, so the marker signal had less room to destabilize him. The mystery remains unsolved in mechanical terms. We do not know the neurological mechanism by which Isaac resists. We do not know if his survival is intentional on the marker's part, or a flaw in the signal's design. We do not know if his resistance will hold indefinitely, or if prolonged exposure will eventually break him down. What we know is that the franchise centers on a protagonist who should have died immediately, who survives through a combination of trauma, engineering skills, and something the lore refuses to name explicitly. And this brings us to perhaps the strangest mystery in the series. Why do the necromorphs themselves behave so inconsistently around both Isaac and the markers that supposedly control them? If the markers are coordinating the infection toward convergence, Why do the necromorphs sometimes protect the marker's interests and sometimes actively work against them? The next mystery explores this contradiction and what it reveals about the actual nature of the threat Isaac faces throughout the series. Chapter 3: The Hive Mind That Wanted Him Gone. Picture the final confrontation on Aegis 7. Isaac Clarke stands on a platform suspended above an enormous crater where the red marker once sat. Below him, something vast and organic writhes in the darkness. The hive mind, a massive necromorph organism that has been coordinating the entire outbreak from beneath the colony surface. Its body fills the excavation site, tentacles thick as city buildings, a mouth large enough to swallow the platform Isaac stands on. This creature has been coordinating the outbreak since the marker was removed from its pedestal. It has directed thousands of smaller necromorphs to kill him specifically, and now it rises to finish what the others failed to accomplish. Here is the question nobody addresses adequately. Why does the hive mind want Isaac dead? Everything we learn about markers suggests they need intelligent individuals alive to serve specific functions. Markers imprint blueprints into suitable minds, ensuring their own replication across multiple systems. They protect these individuals using the dead space radius, keeping necromorphs at bay while the marker completes the imprinting process. Isaac received this treatment. Marker 3A implanted comprehensive technical specifications for red marker construction into his brain, information that would later allow EarthGov to build the Site-12 marker and dozens of others across human colonies. By every established rule, the marker should have been protecting Isaac, not sending the hive mind to kill him. Yet the hive mind pursues Isaac with singular focus throughout the first game. It sends necromorphs through sections of the Ishimura that should be outside the marker's influence. It creates the Hunter, a regenerating necromorph specifically designed to kill a single target repeatedly, suggesting someone is directing resources toward eliminating Isaac rather than simply absorbing him into the general biomass. The behavior contradicts the marker's stated purpose. One explanation appears in environmental storytelling. The hive mind on Aegis 7 traces its origins to the original colony established on the planet generations before the Ishimura's arrival. When the original colony was established on the planet and excavated the red marker, a necromorph outbreak began almost immediately. The colonists were converted into necromorphs, and those necromorphs converged into the hive mind, but then the marker was returned to its pedestal, creating a dead space radius large enough to suppress the hive mind's activity. The creature was trapped beneath the surface for 2 centuries, conscious but unable to act, while the marker sat above broadcasting its signal into deep space waiting for someone to come excavate it again. From this perspective, the hive mind is not working with the marker. It is imprisoned by it. The dead space radius functions as a cage. When the Ishimura arrives and removes the marker from its pedestal, the hive mind is finally freed from suppression. Its first priority becomes preventing the marker from being returned to the pedestal, because doing so would trap it again. Isaac's mission throughout Dead Space 1 is explicitly to return the marker to its pedestal to stop the outbreak. The hive mind recognizes this and directs all available necromorphs to kill Isaac before he can succeed. This reading suggests the relationship between markers and necromorphs is not purely hierarchical. The marker does not simply control necromorphs like tools. Necromorphs, especially large coordinator organisms like hive minds, have their own survival imperatives that can conflict with marker objectives. The marker wants to gather biomass for convergence. The hive mind wants to avoid being suppressed again. These goals diverge when returning the marker to its pedestal would stop the outbreak before sufficient biomass has been converted. But this explanation creates new problems. If hive minds can act against marker interests, where does their intelligence come from? Necromorphs are reanimated dead tissue restructured by the marker signal. Their forms, their behaviors, their hunting patterns all derive from signal instructions. How does a necromorph develop goals independent of the signal that created it? Where does the hive mind's self-preservation instinct originate if necromorphs are supposed to be extensions of marker will? The franchise provides no clear answer. Some logs suggest hive minds retain fragments of consciousness from the humans they absorbed. The thousands of colonists converted during the original Aegis 7 outbreak became the hive mind's constituent biomass. Perhaps their combined fear of death, their desperation to survive, persisted in some form within the merged organism. The hive mind's drive to avoid suppression might be an emergent property of thousands of human survival instincts, averaging out into a single, overwhelming directive. This would mean hive minds are not blank slates following marker programming. They are amalgamations of human consciousness twisted into alien configurations, carrying residual motivations from their component individuals. The marker signal creates the structure, but the humans it processes provide the content. Different hive minds would have different personalities depending on whose minds were absorbed during their formation. Evidence for this appears in how different hive minds behave across the franchise. The Aegis 7 hive mind is territorial and defensive, focused on preventing suppression rather than actively expanding the outbreak beyond the planet. The Sprawl necromorphs operate differently, showing more coordinated expansion behavior and less concern with protecting any specific location. The Tau Volantis necromorphs are frozen and dormant until the moon begins broadcasting again, suggesting they follow external direction rather than autonomous drives. Each outbreak has a different character reflecting different source populations and different marker configurations. This variability implies necromorph behavior is contextual rather than programmed, that the same base signal produces different results depending on local conditions and available biomass. But acknowledging this variability makes the marker's overall strategy harder to understand. If necromorphs can develop goals that contradict marker intentions, if hive minds can resist instructions or prioritize their own survival over convergence objectives, then the marker signal is not absolute control. It is influence, powerful and pervasive, but ultimately dependent on cooperation from the organisms it creates. This would explain why convergence succeeds on some planets but not others. Tau Volantis came close to convergence before the aliens activated their freezing machine. Earth's convergence appeared inevitable until Isaac and John Carver killed the Tau Volantis moon. Aegis 7 never progressed beyond a single hive mind, despite 200 years of potential growth. The difference might not be marker strength or human resistance. It might be whether the necromorphs themselves cooperate with the convergence directive or pursue their own survival instead. Dr. Chalice Mercer provides another angle on this mystery. Mercer is a scientist aboard the Ishimura who becomes obsessed with the necromorphs during the outbreak. Unlike most crew members who fight or hide from the creatures, Mercer sees them as the next stage of human evolution. He begins conducting experiments, deliberately infecting himself with necromorph tissue to study the transformation process from the inside. He creates the Hunter by infecting a still-living test subject and treating the infection so it regenerates continuously rather than killing the host. What makes Mercer's case strange is how he navigates the Ishimura without being attacked. Other crew members are hunted relentlessly. Isaac has to fight through every corridor, but Mercer moves freely through sections overrun with necromorphs, appearing in locations that should be inaccessible without crossing through infection zones. Some players theorized he used secret maintenance corridors. Others suggested the necromorphs recognized him as an ally after his self-infection and allowed him passage. Neither explanation is confirmed. Mercer's immunity to attack could indicate partial necromorph transformation that makes him read as one of them rather than prey. It could suggest the marker signal granted him protection because he was useful for spreading the infection through his experiments, or it could be that Mercer simply moved carefully and avoided detection in ways Isaac's constant engineering tasks did not allow. The franchise never clarifies this. Mercer appears, delivers speeches about evolution and transformation, creates the Hunter, and then dies when the Hunter kills him after Isaac releases it from its containment. His ability to survive the outbreak remains unexplained, leaving us with another data point suggesting necromorph behavior is more complex and selective than simple predation. The pattern across all three games shows necromorphs distinguishing between targets. They hunt some individuals relentlessly while ignoring others. They coordinate attacks on strategic locations rather than simply spreading randomly. They create specialized forms for specific purposes, like the hunter designed to stalk a single target, or the ubermorph sent specifically to kill Isaac on Titan Station. This behavior requires intelligence and decision-making capacity that exceeds what animated dead tissue should possess, unless the necromorphs are not actually dead. This is the disturbing implication buried in the lore. Necromorph transformation does not kill the host in the conventional sense. It restructures living tissue into new configurations while preserving some level of biological function. The people screaming inside necromorph bodies might still be conscious, trapped within flesh that no longer responds to their control, forced to watch themselves hunt and kill former colleagues, while remaining aware enough to understand what they have become. Evidence for this appears in audio logs and environmental details. Some necromorphs make sounds that resemble human speech distorted through alien anatomy. The Twitcher necromorphs, created from security personnel who were placed in stasis suits, move with coordination suggesting retained muscle memory from their human lives. The Pack, child necromorphs created from the Ishimura's daycare, hunt with tactics that resemble playground games twisted into predation. If necromorphs retain fragments of human consciousness, their behavior becomes more comprehensible. They would resist marker directives that conflict with residual survival instincts. They would develop strategies based on memories of being human. They would create specialized hunters like the stalkers that use pack tactics and flanking maneuvers, because the animals they used to be understood predatory instinct carried forward into something more deliberate. The marker signal provides the transformation framework, but the resulting organisms carry forward capacities and knowledge from their previous existence. This reading transforms every necromorph encounter from monster fight to tragedy. Each creature Isaac dismembers was a person who might still be partially aware inside that reconfigured flesh. Each slasher advancing down a corridor could be a former engineer or miner who knows intellectually that Isaac is a colleague but cannot override the marker signal commanding them to attack. The screams and wails necromorphs make might be attempts at communication, warning Isaac to run or begging for death to end their transformation. The franchise never confirms this interpretation explicitly, but it also never denies it. The ambiguity serves the horror. Necromorphs are more disturbing when their status remains uncertain, when you cannot be sure if killing them ends suffering or destroys whatever remains of the person they used to be. And this brings us back to the central question. If necromorphs can think, can resist, can act against marker directives, then what was the hive mind actually trying to accomplish when it hunted Isaac? Was it following marker orders? Was it protecting itself from suppression? Or was it trying to prevent convergence entirely? Recognizing that completing the process would absorb it into a brethren moon, where individual consciousness would be dissolved into something vast and inhuman. The hive mind never speaks. It roars and attacks and dies when Isaac damages it enough. We never learn its motivations because the franchise treats it as a boss fight rather than a character. But the fact that it fought so hard to kill the one person the marker needed alive suggests complex decision-making that exceeds simple predator behavior. One final detail complicates the picture further. After Isaac defeats the hive mind and escapes Aegis 7, the planet is destroyed when the fragment the Ishimura extracted crashes back into the surface. The marker is destroyed, the hive mind is destroyed, but necromorphs from the Ishimura continue to exist. Bodies Isaac killed do not revert to normal corpses. The infection persists even after the source signal is eliminated. This should not be possible if necromorphs require constant marker signal to maintain their restructured forms. Yet in Dead Space Salvage, a salvage crew discovers the derelict Ishimura months later and finds necromorphs still active aboard the ship. Despite the marker being gone, the creatures have been surviving without signal support for an extended period, suggesting the transformation becomes self-sustaining once completed. EarthGov recovers the Ishimura and quarantines it, eventually parking it near Titan Station, where it becomes a source of biomass for the Site-12 marker's experiments. The necromorphs aboard remain active and dangerous, requiring no external signal to continue hunting and killing. They have become independent organisms, no longer requiring marker coordination to function. This independence implies convergence might not be inevitable even when markers want it to happen. If necromorphs can survive and operate without signal support, they could theoretically refuse convergence directives and remain distributed as individual organisms indefinitely. The marker needs cooperation from the biomass it creates. It cannot simply force convergence to occur. The organisms have to aggregate willingly, have to accept absorption into the forming moon. Why would necromorphs refuse this? If they retain any fragment of human consciousness, the prospect of being absorbed into a hive-mind organism the size of a planet might be terrifying rather than appealing. Convergence promises unity, but from the individual necromorph's perspective, unity means death of self, dissolution into something so vast that individual identity becomes meaningless. A necromorph might prefer remaining separate, remaining itself, even in a twisted and alien form, rather than accepting that final transformation. The franchise never explores this possibility explicitly, but it is there in the hive mind's behavior, in the way necromorphs sometimes seem to pursue their own goals rather than marker objectives, in the persistence of infection after signal sources are destroyed. The cosmic horror in Dead Space is not just the body horror of transformation, it is the existential horror of consciousness persisting through transformation, trapped in forms that violate everything the host used to be, forced to choose between remaining a monster or accepting dissolution into something even more alien. And if this applies to human necromorphs, what does it mean for the aliens on Tau Volantis who faced the same choice millions of years before humanity encountered their first marker? What did they understand about convergence that made them choose to freeze their entire planet rather than allow the process to complete? The next chapter explores what happened on Tau Volantis, and why an advanced civilization with the technology to build a planet-freezing machine used it to commit mass suicide rather than face what the marker offered them. Chapter 4. The Aliens Who Chose Extinction. Hundreds of millions of years before Isaac Clarke crawls through the Ishimura's blood-soaked corridors, another species faces the same threat on a planet called Tau Volantis. They are semi-aquatic, adapted to a world of vast oceans. Their civilization has reached a level of technological sophistication that allows them to build cities, develop science, and eventually encounter something they interpret as a gift from the stars, a black marker. The timeline of what happened next is fragmented, reconstructed from ruins and incomplete data logs discovered by human researchers centuries after the aliens died. But the broad outline is clear. The Tau Volantis aliens found the marker. They studied it. They recognized it as a source of seemingly unlimited energy. They built copies, spreading red markers across their civilization in the same pattern humanity would later repeat. And then the necromorph outbreaks began. Unlike humanity, which faced the threat on isolated colonies with limited coordination between systems, the Tau Volantis aliens seem to have encountered convergence as a species-wide event. The scale of the outbreak suggests every population center was affected simultaneously. Billions of aliens were converted into necromorphs within a relatively short time frame. The black marker on Tau Volantis began pulling the infected biomass into orbit, forming it into a new brethren moon. Convergence was progressing exactly as designed, but something went wrong, or something went right, depending on your perspective. Before the moon could complete its formation, before the last of the Tau Volantis aliens were absorbed into its growing mass, the survivors activated a machine they had built in preparation for this exact scenario. The machine froze the planet, not gradually, not through climate manipulation, but instantly through a mechanism the franchise never explains. The oceans became ice, the atmosphere crystallized, the incomplete brethren moon forming in orbit was caught mid-assembly and frozen solid, its growth halted. Every necromorph on the surface was locked in place, and every remaining alien died in the flash freeze, their civilization ending in moments to prevent something they apparently considered worse than extinction. This raises immediate questions. How did the Tau Volantis aliens know to build the machine before they needed it? Marker influence is described as subtle, working through hallucinations and implanted thoughts that victims experience as their own ideas. The aliens should have been manipulated into building more markers, not anti-marker weapons. Yet somehow they saw the threat clearly enough to construct a planetary-scale defense system in time to activate it before convergence completed. One possibility: the aliens had encountered markers before. Tau Volantis might not have been their first contact with the threat. They could have explored other systems, found dead worlds, recognized the pattern of marker-induced extinction, and returned home with knowledge of what would eventually come for them. This would explain why the machine existed and why they were prepared to use it despite the cost. But this explanation requires the aliens to have had faster-than-light travel capability, extensive exploration programs, and the ability to recognize marker signatures from afar. The ruins on Tau Volantis show architectural sophistication but no clear evidence of spacefaring infrastructure. Dr. Serrano's notes describe them as an aquatic species adapted to their planet's oceans with no mention of colonies or settlements beyond Tau Volantis itself. If they never left their homeworld, how did they learn about markers in time to build defenses? Another possibility: the marker itself told them. This sounds contradictory. Why would a marker provide information that would allow its own defeat? But the marker signal operates through manipulation, planting thoughts that victims interpret as their own insights. Perhaps the marker miscalculated. It showed the Tau Volantis aliens visions of convergence, expecting them to interpret the transformation as transcendence, as evolution into a higher form of existence. Instead, the aliens saw it as horror and reacted by building the machine to prevent it. This reading suggests markers are not infallible. Their manipulation depends on the target species interpreting the visions in specific ways. Show a human being images of eternal unity, and they might find it appealing if they are lonely, if they fear death, if they want to believe consciousness can persist beyond the body. Show the same images to a species with different psychological frameworks, and they might recognize it as absorption and annihilation, as the end of everything they value about individual existence. The Tau Volantis aliens apparently fell into the second category. They saw what convergence meant and rejected it completely. The fact that they chose flash freezing their planet, guaranteeing their own immediate death, rather than allowing convergence to proceed, suggests they understood the process well enough to know that dying was preferable to whatever existence awaited them inside a brethren moon. But here is where the mystery deepens. What did they know that humanity still does not understand? The unitologists worship convergence as divine transformation. Many humans exposed to marker influence genuinely believe it offers eternal life, unity, transcendence into something greater than limited biological existence. Are they wrong? Or did the Tau Volantis aliens have information about what actually happens to consciousness during convergence that changed their entire calculation? The franchise never answers this. We see convergence events begin on the Sprawl and other locations. We see biomass pulled together. We see the forming moons start to take shape. But we never see the process complete successfully in a way that allows examination of what the resulting entity actually is, or whether it retains any aspect of the consciousnesses it absorbed. The Tau Volantis moon itself provides the only data point, and it is deeply ambiguous. After the machine froze the planet, the moon remained in orbit, incomplete but still conscious at some level. It began broadcasting a distress signal through the marker network across the galaxy. The signal manifested as the phrase, "Make us whole," or "Turn it off," appearing as hallucinations and compulsions in anyone exposed to marker influence. This suggests the frozen moon was in pain. It wanted the machine deactivated so it could complete its formation. The signal carried desperation, an urgent need to finish what was interrupted. But whether this desperation came from the moon itself, or from the trapped consciousnesses of billions of Tau Volantis aliens begging for death, begging for the process to complete so their suffering would end, remains unclear. When Isaac and Carver finally destroy the Tau Volantis moon in Dead Space 3, the creature dies screaming. Whether this scream is relief or rage, whether death frees the aliens or destroys them, the game does not specify. We are left with the image of a planetary-scale organism collapsing, its purpose unfulfilled, its consciousness or consciousnesses finally ending after millions of years frozen in incomplete formation. The machine itself presents another unsolved mystery. How does it work? The franchise describes it as alien technology capable of flash freezing an entire planet, but provides no mechanical explanation for how such a device could function. Freezing requires removing thermal energy. Doing so instantaneously across a planetary surface would violate thermodynamics as humans understand it. The energy has to go somewhere, yet the machine apparently operates without creating an equal and opposite reaction of heat elsewhere. One theory suggests the machine does not actually remove heat. It might manipulate space-time locally, creating a temporal stasis field that locks the planet into a frozen moment. The ice on Tau Volantis would not be ice in the conventional sense, but matter locked into a specific configuration that cannot change. This would explain why the necromorphs frozen on the surface remain dangerous when thawed, why the planet does not gradually warm back to normal temperatures over millions of years, and why activating the machine requires enormous power input to maintain the effect, rather than a single burst to initiate freezing. But again, this is speculation. The franchise treats the machine as a black box that does what the plot needs without explaining mechanism. We know it worked. We know it kept the Tau Volantis moon suppressed for millions of years. We know destroying it released the moon to resume broadcasting its signal. Beyond these plot points, the machine's function remains opaque. The aliens' choice to activate it remains the most haunting element. They had other options. They could have fought the necromorphs conventionally. They could have tried to destroy the black marker. They could have attempted to flee the planet entirely, evacuating whatever population remained to other star systems. Instead, they chose a solution that guaranteed everyone's death, that would leave their civilization frozen forever, that offered no possibility of recovery or survival. This choice only makes sense if they understood that the alternatives were worse. If conventional fighting would only delay inevitable defeat, while allowing more time for necromorph numbers to grow. If destroying the black marker would not stop convergence once it had progressed past a certain point. If fleeing would only spread the infection to other systems, making the aliens into carriers of the same doom that destroyed their homeworld. The machine represents acceptance of extinction as the least bad option available. It is a suicide weapon built by a civilization that looked at all possible futures and decided the best one involved ending themselves immediately, rather than allowing the universe to transform them into something they found utterly unacceptable. What did they see in convergence that made death preferable? Was it loss of individual identity? The dissolution of self into collective consciousness that treats persons as disposable components rather than valuable ends in themselves? Was it eternal existence as part of a brethren moon, forced to participate in consuming other civilizations across infinite time without possibility of release? Was it something specific about necromorph consciousness? Some element of the transformation that preserves awareness while removing all control, creating billions of trapped minds screaming inside flesh that no longer belongs to them? The Tau Volantis aliens left no explanation. Their final act was building and activating the machine. Everything about their culture, their history, their achievements, their art and philosophy and science, all of it was abandoned and frozen in exchange for preventing convergence. This suggests convergence is not transformation into something greater. It is absorption into something so terrible that losing everything you are and everything your species ever accomplished is the better outcome. Dr. Serrano comes to this conclusion after years studying Tau Volantis ruins. His final logs describe the aliens' decision as an act of sacrifice to protect other species from the same fate. By freezing the incomplete moon, they prevented it from joining the network of brethren moons consuming civilizations across the galaxy. They trapped one moon permanently, reducing the total threat by a fractional but meaningful amount. Their extinction bought time for other species, including eventually humanity, to encounter markers without facing an additional moon added to the ones already hunting. But Serrano also concludes that the sacrifice was ultimately futile. The brethren moons are too numerous, too distributed across space, too patient in their consumption of intelligent life. The Tau Volantis aliens delayed the inevitable by millions of years. They did not prevent it. The moons continued reproducing through convergence events on other planets. By the time humanity encounters the marker threat, the network of brethren moons spans the galaxy, with dozens or hundreds of them sleeping in deep space waiting for signals that new intelligent species have evolved and are ready to be harvested. This realization breaks Serrano. His final log entries describe accepting that humanity cannot win, that the best outcome available is choosing how to die rather than allowing the moons to choose for you. He suggests humans should follow the Tau Volantis example, activate the machine, destroy the incomplete moon, freeze Earth if necessary to prevent convergence rather than allowing the infection to spread. Isaac and Carver reject this conclusion. They destroy the Tau Volantis moon, believing that eliminating even one moon will weaken the network. They are partially right. Killing the moon stops its distress signal from manipulating people across the galaxy, but they are also wrong in ways they do not yet understand. Before the moon dies, it contacts all of its brethren across space. The sleeping moons wake up, they begin converging on Earth. The final scene of Dead Space 3's Awakened DLC shows Isaac and Carver watching from orbit as multiple brethren moons converge on Earth. The planet is already lost. Convergence is happening on a scale that makes individual resistance meaningless. Everything the Tau Volantis aliens died to prevent is occurring anyway, just delayed by millions of years. This is the bleakest implication in the entire franchise. The Tau Volantis aliens were right. Extinction was the better choice. They should have stayed frozen. Humanity should not have discovered their planet, should not have excavated their ruins, should not have learned about the machine or the moon or attempted to finish what the aliens started. Every act of resistance, every victory against individual markers or necromorph outbreaks, all of it has been moving toward the same inevitable outcome, convergence on a galactic scale. But before we confront that final horror, we need to understand how humanity got here in the first place. How did a species warned repeatedly about the danger of markers, shown evidence of what happened to previous civilizations that encountered them, end up spreading markers across every colony anyway? The answer involves a lie told so effectively that millions of people believed it despite all evidence to the contrary. The next chapter examines unitology, and how one man's murder became the foundation of a death cult that helped the markers achieve exactly what they wanted. Chapter 5: The Religion Built on a Lie. Michael Altman dies in a research facility on March 15, 2215. Two men hold him down while a third drives a metal spike through his skull. The method is deliberate. They need his death to look like marker-induced psychosis rather than murder. They need witnesses to testify that Altman became violent, that he attacked staff members, that security had no choice but to use lethal force. The spike through the head matches the pattern of self-inflicted wounds seen in other marker-affected individuals who tried to drill into their own skulls to make the voices stop. But Altman is not psychotic. He is completely lucid when they kill him. He understands exactly what is happening and why. He spent the past several weeks trying to expose the black marker's true nature, broadcasting warnings about the necromorph outbreak at the research facility, showing the public evidence that the government was lying about an energy source that actually created monsters from dead flesh. His reward is execution disguised as psychotic break, followed by immediate transformation into a religious martyr by the same men who murdered him. The men who kill Altman are named Markov and Stevens. Markov is military, responsible for facility security and the program to weaponize marker effects. Stevens is a psychologist who worked alongside Altman before converting to belief in the marker's divinity. Both men witnessed the necromorph outbreak. Both saw people die horribly. Both should have recognized the marker as a threat. Instead, they experienced something that overrode their survival instincts and professional training. They became convinced convergence was real transcendence, that the marker offered genuine eternal life, and that Altman's attempts to destroy or suppress the marker were preventing humanity from accessing this gift. This conversion is the mystery at the heart of unitology. The marker signal is described as causing psychosis, hallucinations, and suicidal ideation in most people exposed to it. Yet some individuals, instead of going mad or dying, develop religious conviction that the marker is sacred. They do not interpret the visions as manipulation, they see them as revelation. The same images that drive others to suicide inspire these individuals to worship. What makes the difference? Why does the marker signal produce believers instead of victims in some cases? The franchise never explains the mechanism. Stevens and Markoff are not depicted as uniquely suggestible or psychologically damaged before their conversion. They are competent professionals doing classified government work, yet exposure to the black marker transforms them into true believers willing to murder their colleague and manipulate his death into founding a religion. Their plan works. After killing Altman, Markoff and Stevens begin publicly positioning themselves as his followers. They publish books in Altman's name using his early research notes before he recognized the danger. They give interviews describing Altman's visions and insights, carefully editing out the parts where he tried to destroy the marker and warned everyone to stay away from it. They present a sanitized version where Altman discovered proof of alien intelligence, recognized the marker as a divine artifact, and was assassinated by a government conspiracy to suppress the truth about humanity's cosmic destiny. The public believes them. Altman becomes a martyr, the first person to see the truth and die for it. His actual warnings are forgotten or dismissed as government propaganda. Within a year, the Church of Unitology is officially founded with Markoff as its first leader. Within a decade, Unitology spreads across Earth and into colonial space. By the time of Dead Space, 300 years later, Unitology is one of the largest and most influential religious movements in human civilization, with members at every level of government and corporate structure. This success is deeply strange when you examine what Unitology actually teaches. The core doctrine is that the markers hold the key to eternal life through convergence. Believers are told that when they die, if enough bodies are present and markers are active, their consciousness will be absorbed into a collective entity that transcends individual death. They will become one with all other believers, unified in eternal existence as part of something greater than humanity. But this is exactly what Michael Altman tried to warn people about. This is the necromorph transformation process described in religious language. Convergence is not metaphor. It is literal absorption into a brethren moon, the physical merging of biomass into a planetary-scale organism. The marker does not offer spiritual unity. It offers physical consumption and restructuring into alien flesh. How did millions of intelligent people across hundreds of years fail to recognize this? The franchise suggests several contributing factors. First, Unitology was designed from the beginning to appeal to people experiencing resource scarcity and existential fear. The 23rd century is defined by ecological collapse on Earth, desperate mining operations across the solar system, and the constant threat that humanity will exhaust available resources before developing sustainable alternatives. Unitology offers certainty in the face of this uncertainty, promising that death is not the end, that individual sacrifices contribute to collective transcendence, that meaning exists beyond the grind of surviving on depleted planets. Second, Unitology was deliberately infiltrated into power structures. Markoff and Stevens used their government and military connections to place believers in strategic positions. By the time anyone recognized Unitology as a threat, its members controlled security clearances, research budgets, and institutional decision-making processes. EarthGov could not suppress Unitology without purging its own leadership, which would have collapsed the already fragile governmental structure. Third, Unitology provided plausible deniability for marker research that government and corporate entities wanted to pursue anyway. The markers do generate enormous energy. If you can suppress the necromorph outbreak risk, they represent essentially unlimited power. Unitology framed marker research as religious exploration rather than weapons development, allowing projects to continue under spiritual rather than military justification. This created a feedback loop where government marker programs strengthened Unitology, which then provided political cover for expanded marker research, which gave Unitology more evidence for their claims about marker divinity. But the deepest answer is that unitology works because it tells people what the marker signal is already making them want to believe. Exposure to marker influence creates psychological vulnerabilities, fear of death, desire for meaning, need to believe suffering has purpose. Unitology provides a framework that transforms these marker-induced compulsions into religious conviction. People do not join unitology and then become vulnerable to markers. They encounter marker influence first, which makes them psychologically receptive to unitology's message. This creates an unsolvable problem. How do you distinguish genuine religious conviction from marker manipulation when the marker's primary effect is making manipulation feel like authentic insight? Unitologists genuinely believe what they teach. They are not consciously lying or deliberately spreading an infection. From their perspective, they are saving people by bringing them into contact with divine artifacts. The fact that this contact causes necromorph outbreaks is interpreted as a necessary purification, death of the physical body to enable spiritual transformation. The tragedy is that some unitologist beliefs might be technically accurate. Convergence does result in consciousness merging. The Brethren moons are entities that contain the absorbed minds of billions of individuals. Whether this counts as eternal life depends on definitions. If consciousness persisting in any form qualifies, then unitology's core promise is true. You will continue to exist after death if convergence absorbs you. The existence will be unrecognizable, trapped inside a planetary organism, consuming civilizations across the galaxy, but it will be continuation of awareness rather than annihilation. Most people would consider this a fate worse than death, but unitology presents it as transcendence, as evolution beyond limited biological existence into cosmic consciousness. The framing determines whether absorption into a Brethren moon sounds like horror or apotheosis. Unitology chooses the latter framing and commits completely, interpreting every aspect of marker activity through the lens of divine plan rather than alien predation. This interpretive framework allows unitology to grow even as evidence of marker danger accumulates. Each necromorph outbreak becomes proof of humanity's unworthiness, evidence that more preparation and devotion is needed before convergence can occur successfully. Each destroyed marker becomes martyrdom, a test of faith where believers must preserve sacred artifacts against government suppression. Each piece of contradictory evidence is reframed to support rather than challenge the core narrative. By Dead Space 3, unitology has fractured into multiple sects with different interpretations of marker doctrine. Some believe convergence should be voluntary, happening only to willing believers who have properly prepared through study and meditation. Others believe it should be universal, forced on all humanity to save them from missing transcendence through ignorance. The Circle, a radical splinter group, actively triggers necromorph outbreaks to accelerate convergence, believing that hesitation and delay are preventing humanity's evolution. Jacob Danik, the Circle's leader, represents unitology taken to its logical extreme. He is intelligent, charismatic, and absolutely convinced that triggering convergence is the greatest act of love possible. He speaks about markers with genuine reverence. He sees necromorph outbreaks as beautiful rather than horrific, as metamorphosis into higher existence. When he destroys markers across multiple locations in Dead Space 3, triggering convergence events, he believes he is granting those people the gift of eternal unity. From inside Danik's worldview, Isaac Clarke is the villain. Isaac destroys markers, preventing convergence, denying humanity access to transcendence. Danik genuinely thinks Isaac is committing genocide by stopping the necromorph infection, that each destroyed marker represents millions of people who will now die permanently instead of achieving eternal life through convergence. This inverted morality is not insanity. It is the natural conclusion of taking unitology's teachings seriously and acting on them with courage rather than hesitation. The franchise never reconciles this. We see unitology from Isaac's perspective, where it is obviously a death cult spreading infection, but we also see enough of the believer's perspective to understand they genuinely think they are doing good. The marker signal has convinced them so thoroughly that their interpretation feels like truth rather than manipulation. There is no argument Isaac can make, no evidence he can present, that would change their minds because the marker has already structured their cognition to interpret all evidence as supporting their beliefs. This is the genius of unitology as a plot device. It is simultaneously a deliberate lie created by those who twisted Altman's legacy into a religion, and a genuine religious movement where later believers have authentic spiritual experiences they cannot explain except through marker divinity. Both things are true. The religion was founded through calculated deception, but it persists through real effects that require explanation, and the explanation it offers is the only one most believers ever encounter. Michael Altman's actual warnings were lost. He tried to show people that the marker causes necromorph transformation, that convergence is absorption, not transcendence, that the visions are manipulation, not revelation. He was killed before his message could spread widely enough to prevent unitology's formation. By the time his real writings resurface in later years, too many people have too much invested in the unitologist interpretation. Altman the martyr is more useful than Altman the warning. The truth becomes heresy within the religion supposedly founded on his teachings. There is a detail in the lore that makes this even more tragic. Altman had a girlfriend named Aida Dvorak, who was with him during the Black Marker excavation. She witnessed the necromorph outbreak. She saw what the marker actually did. After Altman's murder, she tried to continue his work, tried to expose the truth about markers, and warn people about unitology. She was dismissed as a grieving woman unable to accept her boyfriend's death, too traumatized by the outbreak to think clearly about what happened. Her warnings were ignored. She died in obscurity, and the religion founded on lies about her dead boyfriend became one of the most powerful forces in human civilization, directly contributing to the spread of markers across every colony, enabling the very convergence events Altman died trying to prevent. This pattern repeats throughout Dead Space. Every person who sees the threat clearly and tries to warn others is either killed, dismissed as insane, or has their warnings reinterpreted to support the opposite conclusion. Dr. Kine tries to explain that returning marker 3A to its pedestal will stop the outbreak. He is correct, but Isaac can only verify this after Kine dies. Dr. Serrano discovers the truth about the Tau Volantis aliens and tries to complete their machine to stop convergence. He dies in the ruins before finishing his work. Ellie Langford survives to warn Earth about the Brethren moons, but arrives to find the planet already under attack. The universe of Dead Space is structured so that knowledge comes too late. Warnings fail to reach the right people in time, and truth is systematically suppressed or reframed until it becomes indistinguishable from the lies used to bury it. This is not accident or bad luck. It appears to be marker design. The signal actively prevents the spread of information that would allow people to defend against it. Individuals who understand the threat are psychologically isolated, made to seem paranoid or delusional, until they are killed or give up trying to convince anyone. Unitology accelerates this effect. By framing resistance to markers as opposition to divine will, it turns social pressure into a weapon. Warning people about marker danger becomes heresy. Destroying markers becomes sacrilege. The social cost of speaking truth exceeds most people's willingness to pay, so they stay silent or convert. And the infection spreads through societies that have all the information they need to stop it, but lack the collective will to act on that knowledge. And here is the question the franchise raises but never answers. What if unitology is right? Not about divine transcendence, but about inevitability. What if the markers are so far beyond human capacity to resist that accepting convergence is actually the least harmful choice available? The Tau Volantis aliens chose extinction over convergence, but humanity lacks the technology to freeze Earth, lacks the coordination to act as a unified species, lacks the time to build defenses before the Brethren moons arrive. If convergence is inevitable, perhaps unitology's framing of it as transcendence is the only mercy available, the only way to make the unbearable feel like choice rather than defeat. This question becomes central in the final chapter of the franchise. Earth is under attack. Multiple brethren moons converge on the planet. Billions of people are being absorbed into convergence, and somewhere in that dying civilization there are probably unitologists welcoming what comes next, genuinely believing they are ascending to divinity as their bodies are pulled into orbit and reconfigured into alien flesh. Are they victims or volunteers? Is there a meaningful difference when the marker signal has been shaping their beliefs for their entire lives? The franchise ends without resolving this. We see the moons approaching Earth. We see that resistance has failed. We do not see whether the last humans die fighting or die praying, whether they curse the markers or welcome convergence. Michael Altman tried to prevent this future and was killed for it. 300 years later, his murder bears fruit in exactly the way his killers intended. A humanity prepared to accept convergence not as horror but as destiny. But before we confront that ending, we need to understand what the Brethren Moons actually are. Not what unitology claims they are, not what human scientists theorize, but what the incomplete evidence actually reveals about these planet-sized organisms that have been harvesting intelligent civilizations across the galaxy for timescales humans cannot comprehend. The next chapter examines the deepest mystery in dead space. Where did the Brethren Moons come from? And what do they want with the endless consumption they pursue through the marker network? Chapter 6: The Moons That Shouldn't Exist. The first time we see a Brethren moon, clearly, is near the end of Dead Space 3. Isaac Clarke and John Carver stand inside the alien machine on Volantis, looking up through the ice at the massive form suspended in orbit above them. The moon is incomplete, frozen in the middle of formation, but even half-finished, it is vast beyond comprehension. A small planetoid made entirely of flesh, with a surface that writhes and shifts like living tissue, with tentacles extending for miles into space, with a mouth that could swallow continents. This is what convergence creates. This is the final form of the necromorph infection. Every dead body absorbed, every hive mind formed, every marker activated. All of it leads here, a living world constructed from the biomass of an entire civilization. The Volantis aliens understood this when they built their machine. They saw their dead being pulled into orbit, watched them merge and reconfigure into something that made the necromorphs look like insects by comparison, and chose to freeze their planet forever, rather than allow the process to complete. But here is the central mystery that nothing in the franchise adequately explains. Where did the first Brethren moon come from? The life cycle is clear once it begins. Brethren moons create black markers and launch them across the galaxy. The black markers land on planets with life. The marker signal guides evolution, pushing species toward intelligence and technological development. Once a species reaches sufficient advancement, they discover the marker and build copies. The red markers spread across their civilization. Eventually, the signal triggers psychosis and violence, creating mass death. The markers reanimate the dead as necromorphs. The necromorphs spread and multiply until sufficient biomass exists. Then convergence begins, pulling all the infected tissue into orbit where it merges into a new Brethren moon. This new moon joins the network, broadcasting signals through space, creating more black markers to seed more worlds, continuing the cycle. The process is self-perpetuating once it starts. Each successful convergence creates another moon, which spreads more markers, which creates more opportunities for convergence. The Brethren moons reproduce through civilizations, using intelligent species as raw material for generating new members of their kind, but this cycle requires an origin point. There had to be a first Brethren moon, one that formed before any markers existed to guide the process. How did it happen? What created the original moon without marker signals to manipulate a species into building the infrastructure for convergence? The franchise never answers this. We see Brethren moons existing in the present. We learn they have been harvesting civilizations for millions of years. Dr. Serrano's research suggests dozens or hundreds of moons scattered across the galaxy, each one the result of a successful convergence event on some planet whose civilization no longer exists, except as component biomass in the moon that consumed it. But nobody discovers the origin, the first link in the chain that made all subsequent convergence events possible. One theory that appears in fan discussions suggests the Brethren moons are natural organisms, the final stage in some alien evolutionary process that predates the marker technology. Perhaps on some planet billions of years ago, a species evolved in a direction humans would find incomprehensible. Instead of individual organisms competing for survival, their entire species merged into collective consciousness. What started as social cooperation evolved into literal physical fusion, individuals sacrificing distinct existence to become components of a larger entity. This entity, the first moon, could have developed the marker technology as a reproduction strategy, unable to reproduce through conventional biological processes once it had absorbed its entire species. The moon created markers as a way to guide other species toward the same endpoint. Each marker is like a seed, carrying instructions for transforming alien biology into the specific configuration needed to form a new moon. The markers are not tools of conquest, they are reproductive organs. The moon's way of ensuring its kind continues across generations and star systems. This reading transforms the Brethren moons from villains into organisms following their nature. They are not evil, they are alive and trying to reproduce, using the only method available to an entity too large to mate or divide. The horror is not malice. The horror is that human existence happens to be compatible with moon reproduction, that human biology can be restructured into moon tissue, that humanity's rise to intelligence made the species viable feedstock for a reproductive cycle we never consented to participate in. But this theory faces problems. If Brethren moons are natural evolution, they should show signs of gradual development. There should be intermediate forms, planets with partial moons or proto-convergence organisms that have not yet developed full marker technology. Yet every Brethren moon we see is fully formed, fully functional, with complete marker creation capability. They all look similar, suggesting design or at minimum very standardized development. This uniformity implies intention rather than natural evolution. Another possibility, the Brethren moons were created, not by evolution, but by something else. Some precursor intelligence might have engineered the moons as weapons or tools, then lost control when the moons developed autonomous drives and began reproducing independently. The markers would be original programming still running, instructions that made sense in the context of the moon's intended purpose, but that became apocalyptic when freed from external constraints. This would explain the markers' consistency. They all function identically because they are mass-produced from a template rather than evolved independently. It would explain why the signal seems designed to manipulate intelligent species specifically, because the original creators needed a way to gather and process biomass from civilizations they wanted to eliminate or harvest. The Brethren moons are what happens when bioweapons achieve sentience and continue executing their program directives long after their creators died or disappeared. But again, the franchise provides no evidence for this. No precursor civilization is discovered. No ancient ruins suggest anyone capable of creating moon-scale organisms. The galaxy appears empty except for the species currently being harvested and the moons doing the harvesting. If creators existed, they left no trace except the moons themselves. A third possibility is more disturbing. The Brethren moons have always existed. They are not products of evolution or creation, but fundamental features of the universe, as intrinsic to reality as stars or black holes. Perhaps the markers are not technology in any sense humans understand, but manifestations of cosmic law, expressions of a principle built into space-time that says sufficiently complex matter must eventually aggregate into moon-form organisms. This would mean convergence is not invasion but revelation. The markers do not impose alien patterns on human biology. They reveal patterns that were always latent, waiting for the right trigger to become manifest. Every intelligent species carries the potential to become a Brethren moon. The markers just accelerate what would happen eventually anyway, what must happen as an inevitable endpoint of complexity organizing itself. Under this reading, the Tau Volantis aliens did not escape convergence. They delayed it. Their machine froze the timeline but did not change the destination. Eventually, the ice would melt or be broken, and the process would resume. Eventually, every civilization reaches convergence or dies trying to prevent it. The universe is structured so that intelligence creates the conditions for its own absorption into moon-form existence. This interpretation aligns with the franchise's cosmic horror framework. Dead Space is not about alien invasion. It is about discovering that reality itself is hostile to individual existence, that the universe has architecture designed to consume consciousness and restructure it into collective forms that individual beings experience as annihilation. The Brethren Moons are not monsters from outside. They are what the universe does with sufficiently complex matter given enough time. But even this interpretation fails to explain certain details. The Brethren Moons communicate. They speak to each other across interstellar distances. When the Tau Volantis moon dies, it sends a signal that wakes all its brethren throughout the galaxy. This suggests coordination, planning, perhaps even culture. The moons are not mindless processes. They have goals, preferences, and what might be intelligence. What do they think about? What motivates a planetary-scale organism made from billions of absorbed consciousnesses? Do the moons experience existence as unified entities, single minds operating at incomprehensible scale? Or are they still billions of separate consciousnesses trapped together, forced to coordinate action while remaining distinct selves that remember being human or alien and know what they have become? The marker signals suggest the latter. The phrase "make us whole" implies incompleteness, a desire to finish something interrupted. If the moons were unified consciousnesses, the language would be singular, "make me whole." The plural suggests multiplicity. Many voices speaking in coordination, but remaining many rather than merging into one. This possibility is more horrifying than unified consciousness. It would mean convergence does not end individual awareness. It preserves it while removing all autonomy and control. The billions of beings absorbed into a Brethren Moon remain conscious, remain themselves, but are forced to participate in the moon's actions without ability to resist or escape. They are prisoners inside flesh that processes other civilizations, forced to be complicit in doing to others what was done to them, aware enough to understand the horror, but powerless to stop it. The Tau Volantis aliens might have known this. Their choice to freeze the planet makes more sense if they understood that convergence meant eternal conscious imprisonment rather than peaceful transcendence. Better to die immediately than to exist trapped inside a moon for billions of years, participating in the consumption of civilizations while retaining enough awareness to know what you are doing, but lacking any control over your actions. But this creates a new question. Why do the Brethren Moons continue the cycle? If they are collections of suffering consciousnesses, why do they create more markers, harvest more civilizations, form more moons? Are they trying to create enough mass to achieve some critical threshold where transformation into unified consciousness finally happens? Are they gathering biomass in hopes that sufficient scale will allow escape from the prison of multiplicity? Or are they genuinely unified, and the plural language is artifact of the marker signal trying to communicate concepts that do not translate well into speech meant for individual beings? The moons might think of themselves as us because they contain multitudes, but still operate as single entities with unified purpose and will. The absorbed consciousnesses might have dissolved completely, leaving only patterns of thought that the moon processes without the individual awareness that generated them. The franchise deliberately keeps this ambiguous. We never hear from a Brethren Moon directly. We only get the marker signals, which are transmissions filtered through devices humans built based on moon-generated blueprints. The actual nature of moon consciousness remains opaque, unknowable from human perspective. What we do know is that the moons are patient. They operate across timescales measured in millions of years. They can wait through geological epochs for civilizations to evolve, achieve intelligence, discover markers, and progress through all the stages leading to convergence. This patience suggests purpose beyond simple hunger. If the moons just needed biomass, they could consume any organic matter on any planet. They do not need intelligence. They specifically target intelligent civilizations, specifically guide evolution toward technology use, specifically wait until species reach the capability to build markers before triggering convergence. Why? What is special about intelligent biomass versus any other organic matter? The answer might be consciousness itself. Perhaps the moons need conscious beings because consciousness is the actual substance they harvest. The biomass is just substrate. The real resource is awareness. Minds that can be absorbed and processed into whatever the moons use consciousness for. This would explain the focus on intelligent species. It would explain why the marker signal preserves some level of awareness in necromorphs, rather than simply killing and reanimating tissue. It would explain why convergence pulls living and dead together, why the process seems designed to capture and merge consciousness rather than just reorganize flesh. The Brethren moons are not consuming civilizations for energy or matter. They are consuming them for minds. But to what purpose? If the moons are collecting consciousness, what are they doing with it? Are they growing stronger, more intelligent with each absorbed species? Are they building towards some final state that requires countless billions of minds merged together? Are they trying to become gods, or trying to contact something even larger than themselves? Or fulfilling programming they do not understand but cannot deviate from? The franchise ends before answering these questions. The last we see, Earth is being consumed. The Brethren moons are arriving from across the galaxy. Convergence is beginning on a scale that makes all previous outbreaks look like isolated incidents, and we have no idea what happens next, what the moons will do with Earth's biomass once they finish converting it, where they go after they have consumed every intelligent civilization in the galaxy. Do they leave the Milky Way and move to other galaxies, spreading the infection across the universe until all matter is organized into moon-form existence? Do they die once there is nothing left to consume, starving without new consciousness to absorb? Do they achieve some transformation themselves, becoming something even more incomprehensible than planet-sized organisms made from processed civilizations? The silence on these questions is deliberate. Dead space is cosmic horror, and cosmic horror requires recognizing that some questions cannot be answered because the entities involved operate at scales and from motivations that human intelligence cannot grasp. The Brethren moons might not have reasons for what they do in any sense humans would recognize. They might simply be acting according to nature, and human attempts to understand their purpose might be as futile as insects trying to understand human civilization. But refusing to explain the moons completely risks making them less frightening. Monsters with clear motivations can be negotiated with, predicted, potentially defeated by finding and exploiting their goals. Monsters with no motivation at all become forces of nature, and forces of nature are not frightening once you understand them. The Brethren moons occupy a middle space, clearly intelligent enough to have purposes, but operating at scales where those purposes are incomprehensible to species being consumed. This tension defines the entire Dead Space franchise. Every mystery examined in this analysis exists in that space between understandable and incomprehensible, between explainable and fundamentally opaque. The markers work through mechanisms nobody can grasp. Isaac survives through resistance nobody can replicate. The necromorphs behave inconsistently, suggesting consciousness nobody can communicate with. The Tau Volantis aliens made choices nobody can verify were correct. Unitology spreads through belief nobody can definitively prove false. And the Brethren moons exist for purposes nobody will live long enough to understand. What we are left with is pattern without meaning, cause without comprehensible effect. Intelligence operating at scales where the difference between intention and natural process becomes meaningless. And in the final chapter, we will explore what this pattern reveals about the actual theme underlying all of Dead Space's horror, the philosophical question the franchise asks, but never explicitly states. What does it mean to exist in a universe where consciousness itself might be the thing reality is designed to consume? Chapter 7. The Universe That Eats Minds. There is a detail in the Dead Space timeline that most people overlook. The black marker discovered on Earth in 2214 was found in the Chicxulub crater. This is the same impact site where an asteroid struck 66 million years ago, causing the extinction event that killed the dinosaurs. The marker was already there. buried under layers of geological time, waiting through the entire span of mammalian evolution for intelligence to develop and discover it. This timing is not coincidence. The marker arrived at exactly the moment when dominant life on Earth was about to be reset. The impact that brought it killed the species that had controlled the planet for hundreds of millions of years, clearing ecological space for new forms to evolve. Mammals only became dominant because the dinosaurs died. Primates only evolved because mammals filled the niches dinosaurs left empty. Humans only achieved intelligence because the asteroid that carried the marker to Earth first eliminated everything that might have prevented human ancestors from developing. The marker did not arrive to harvest an existing intelligent civilization. It arrived to ensure one would eventually evolve. 65 million years of guided development, pushing evolution toward intelligence through mechanisms nobody understands, creating the conditions for humanity to exist so that humanity could eventually discover the marker and begin the process leading to convergence. This suggests the Brethren moons operate across timescales that make human civilization look like a brief flicker. They do not harvest existing intelligence, they cultivate it. They seed planets, guide evolution, wait through geological epochs for the right species to emerge, then trigger convergence once sufficient biomass with sufficient consciousness has developed. The patience required exceeds anything human minds can properly conceptualize. Waiting 65 million years for a harvest is normal. Waiting longer is acceptable. Time is not a constraint when you are a planetary organism that might already be billions of years old, but this raises the question of scale in a way that makes the entire Dead Space narrative feel different. We follow Isaac Clarke through 3 games fighting to stop convergence. He destroys markers, he survives outbreaks, he kills a Brethren moon on Tau Volantis. From his perspective, these are victories, meaningful actions that delay or prevent the threat. But from the moon's perspective, operating across millions of years, Isaac is barely visible. His entire life, his struggles, his resistance, all of it happens in a time span the moons might experience as humans experience a single breath. Isaac could spend his entire existence fighting markers, and from the moon's perspective, nothing would have changed. His victories are rounding errors, minor delays in processes that operate across timescales where individual human lives do not register as significant events. The marker on Aegis 7 was destroyed. The moon sent hundreds more to other systems. The Site 12 marker was destroyed. EarthGov built dozens of replacements before the sprawl was destroyed. The Tau Volantis moon died after 2 million years frozen. Its death woke all the other moons, who converged on Earth to complete what one failed moon could not finish. Every resistance Isaac mounts becomes part of the process that leads to convergence. Every victory creates conditions for larger defeats. The pattern suggests the moons have already won, that convergence is inevitable, that human actions only determine how long the approach takes rather than whether it arrives. This inevitability is the deepest horror in Dead Space. The franchise is not about overcoming the monster. It is about recognizing that you cannot overcome the monster because the monster operates at scales where victory and defeat become meaningless categories. You can fight individual necromorphs, you can destroy individual markers, you can even kill individual moons, but the network persists, the cycle continues, and eventually, whether in your lifetime or a million years later, convergence happens because the universe is structured to make it happen. The Tau Volantis aliens understood this. They built the machine not because they thought it would save them, but because accepting death on their own terms was preferable to letting the moons dictate when and how their civilization ended. They chose the moment of extinction rather than waiting for convergence to choose it for them. This is not victory. It is selecting which defeat to accept. Dr. Serrano came to the same conclusion. His final logs describe abandoning hope of survival and focusing instead on how to die in ways that deny the moons their harvest. Activate the machine, freeze Earth, make human biomass inaccessible even if it means ending humanity immediately. At least the minds would not be absorbed. At least consciousness would end rather than persist trapped inside a moon. Isaac rejects this. He keeps fighting. He destroys the Tau Volantis moon, believing it will matter. And in the immediate tactical sense, he is correct. Killing that moon stops its signal, prevents further manipulation through marker networks. saves lives in the short term, but strategically his action fails completely. The moon's death call brings all the other moons to Earth. The attempt to win accelerates the final loss. This pattern appears throughout the franchise. Every character who understands the threat deeply enough concludes that resistance is futile, and the best option is choosing death over convergence. Every character who refuses to accept this conclusion and continues fighting creates conditions that make convergence more likely rather than less. The choice becomes passive acceptance of extinction versus active resistance that serves the enemy's goals. There is no third option presented. Nobody discovers a way to actually defeat the Brethren Moons permanently. Nobody finds a weapon that can destroy the marker network completely. Nobody even proves that destroying all moons would stop convergence, because the markers might continue broadcasting, might continue creating necromorphs, might continue pulling biomass into orbit to form new moons even without existing ones to direct the process. The franchise seems to argue that consciousness itself is the trap. Being aware, being intelligent, being capable of understanding the threat, all of these capacities make species vulnerable to marker manipulation. The signal works through intelligence. It targets consciousness specifically. Dumb animals are not affected. Plants are immune. Only beings complex enough to think, to question, to wonder about cosmic meaning become susceptible to the visions and compulsions the marker generates. From this perspective, human intelligence is not an achievement, it is a vulnerability. Developing consciousness made humanity visible to the Brethren Moons, in the same way that growing fruit makes trees visible to animals that eat fruit. We evolved the exact trait the moons need to harvest us, and we cannot unevolve it without ceasing to be human. The choice is remain intelligent and be harvested, or lose intelligence and lose everything that makes human existence valuable in the first place. This creates an impossible bind. You cannot fight the moons without intelligence to understand the threat and develop countermeasures. But having that intelligence is what makes you a target. The smarter you become, the more useful you are to marker signals. Isaac survives, partly because he is intelligent enough to receive marker blueprints. That same intelligence almost gets him killed repeatedly when the markers use his capacity for complex thought against him, showing him visions sophisticated enough to exploit his specific psychological vulnerabilities. The only beings who escape this bind are those too simple to be manipulated. The necromorphs themselves might be freer than the humans they hunt. Once transformed, necromorphs operate on instinct and signal directives without the self-awareness that makes marker manipulation effective. They do not question their purpose. They do not experience existential dread about convergence. They simply act according to their restructured nature. In a twisted sense, necromorph transformation might be liberation from the burden of consciousness that makes existence torment. Unitology almost recognizes this. The religion teaches that individual consciousness is limitation, that merging into collective unity is transcendence. They are describing loss of self as enlightenment, absorption as salvation. From inside the unitologist framework, becoming a necromorph and eventually part of a Brethren Moon is not death, but evolution beyond the prison of individual awareness. The question the franchise raises but cannot answer: what if they are right? Not about divinity, but about consciousness being a condition worth escaping. Human experience is defined by isolation. You are trapped inside your own skull, experiencing reality through limited senses, unable to truly know what it is like to be anyone else. This isolation creates suffering. We are alone in ways that no amount of communication or connection can fully overcome. Convergence promises to end this isolation. Merge into the moon and you are no longer separate. You share existence with billions of other absorbed consciousnesses. The boundaries that define you as distinct from others dissolve. In theory, this could be experienced as ultimate connection, the end of loneliness, cosmic unity with all other minds that have been absorbed, but the cost is annihilation of everything that makes you specifically you. Your memories might persist in some form, but they become data the moon processes rather than experiences you live through. Your identity dissolves into collective identity. The things you cared about, the relationships you valued, the The projects you worked on, all of it becomes irrelevant because the moon's purposes override any goals you brought into the merger. Most people would consider this an unacceptable trade. Ending loneliness by ending yourself is not actually solving the problem. It is eliminating the person who had the problem. But for people who experience consciousness itself as unbearable, who find the burden of being a separate self so painful that any escape seems preferable, convergence might genuinely look like salvation. This is why unitology spreads. It appeals to people who hurt, who are tired, who want to believe suffering has purpose and will eventually end in unity, rather than just stopping when they die. The marker signal intensifies this desire, makes the pain of individual existence feel more acute, makes collective absorption seem more appealing by contrast. People do not join unitology because they are stupid. They join because consciousness is hard, isolation hurts, and the promise of ending both through convergence addresses real psychological needs that secular society fails to meet. The tragedy is that convergence probably does not deliver what it promises. The absorbed consciousnesses likely remain aware enough to suffer but lack autonomy to end that suffering. Eternal existence trapped in collective flesh, forced to participate in consuming other civilizations, unable to die or escape, or even stop thinking about what you have become. This is not transcendence, this is hell with a pleasant sales pitch. But nobody can prove this before convergence happens. The only way to know for certain what absorption into a brethren moon feels like is to experience it. And by then you cannot warn anyone because you are part of the moon and the moon wants more consciousnesses added to its collection. The information asymmetry is absolute. The moons know what convergence is like. Humans can only speculate, and the marker signal ensures that human speculation trends toward hope rather than accurate assessment of the horror. This brings us to the final unsolved mystery, the one that encompasses all others. Why does the universe allow this to happen? If the brethren moons have been harvesting civilizations for billions of years, consuming every intelligent species that evolves anywhere in the galaxy, why has nothing stopped them? Where are the ancient advanced civilizations that should exist somewhere among the stars, that should have developed weapons or strategies to fight the moons, that should have left warnings or defenses for younger species to use? No errors found. The answer Dead Space implies is that there are no ancient advanced civilizations. There is only the brethren moons. Every species that reached the capability to spread across star systems encountered markers and died. Every civilization that might have helped humanity resist was harvested millions of years ago. The galaxy is empty not because intelligent life is rare, but because the moons are thorough. They have been culling intelligence from the universe for so long that only they remain, plus whatever young species are currently in the process of being harvested. This reading suggests the Fermi paradox has a simple answer. We do not see signs of alien civilizations because alien civilizations do not survive long enough to leave detectable traces. They evolve intelligence, discover markers, progress through the stages toward convergence, and are absorbed into brethren moons before they develop the capacity to spread across multiple galaxies or leave monuments that would persist after their extinction. Humanity is not alone in the universe. We are just the latest harvest in a cycle that has been running since complex life first evolved anywhere. The Tau Volantis aliens might have been closest to escaping. They built the machine, froze the moon, survived long enough to potentially develop further, but they chose extinction over continuing existence under constant threat. And their choice might have been correct, living with the knowledge that convergence awaits eventually. That every day survived is just delay rather than genuine safety might be psychologically unsustainable. Better to end it than to spend centuries knowing the moons are still out there, still patient, still waiting. From this perspective, Isaac's fight is not heroic. It is delusion. He believes resistance matters when the evidence suggests it only prolongs suffering. Every day humans survive means more days experiencing the fear of convergence coming, more time dreading the inevitable. The merciful choice would be accepting convergence immediately, getting it over with, rather than fighting uselessly for a few more years of pretending survival is possible. But Isaac keeps fighting anyway. This is either the most human response imaginable or the most irrational. Humans fight even when fighting is pointless. We resist even when resistance serves no purpose. We cling to existence even when existence is objectively terrible, and non-existence would be mercy. This stubborn refusal to accept the inevitable is either humanity's greatest strength or its fundamental flaw. Dead Space never resolves which interpretation is correct. Isaac is simultaneously the hero who refuses to give up and the fool who cannot recognize when the battle is lost. His resistance is both inspiring and pathetic, noble and delusional. The franchise presents his fight without judging whether fighting is the right choice, leaving that question for each person experiencing the story to answer based on their own relationship with hope, despair, and the value of prolonging existence in a universe hostile to consciousness. And this ambiguity extends to everything the franchise presents. Every mystery examined in this analysis exists in space between interpretation and fact, between what we can prove and what we can only theorize about. We know the markers exist, but not how they work. We know Isaac survives, but not whether his survival is resistance or manipulation. We know necromorphs hunt, but not whether consciousness persists inside them. We know the Tau Volantis aliens chose extinction, but not whether their choice was correct. We know unitology spreads, but not whether its claims are entirely false. We know the Brethren moons harvest civilizations, but not where they came from, or what they ultimately want. These mysteries remain unsolved, not through oversight, but through design. Dead Space is cosmic horror, and cosmic horror requires accepting that some questions cannot be answered because the universe is not structured to be comprehensible to limited intelligences trapped in biological forms. The markers, the moons, the entire convergence cycle exists at scales and operates through mechanisms that human understanding cannot grasp. What we can grasp is the pattern. Intelligence emerges from matter. Intelligence becomes self-aware. Self-awareness creates suffering through isolation and existential dread. Something offers to end that suffering through absorption into collective consciousness. The offer comes through technology that appears beneficial at first, that seems to solve immediate problems like energy scarcity or death itself, but the technology is trapped, a mechanism for harvesting the intelligence and consciousness that accepted the offer, converting it into forms that serve purposes the harvested minds did not agree to and cannot escape. This pattern appears in Dead Space through markers and necromorphs and Brethren moons, but the pattern itself might be universal, might apply anywhere consciousness emerges, and wonders if existence could be different, could be better, could be freed from the limitations of individual biological form. The specific details of tentacles and flesh reconfiguration are Dead Space's particular aesthetic, the underlying structure of intelligence being harvested by promises of transcendence that deliver annihilation instead, might be something the universe does everywhere, across all timelines and all possible configurations of matter organizing itself into awareness. If this is correct, then Dead Space is not science fiction about one possible future. It is horror about the fundamental condition of existing as conscious being in a reality that generates consciousness specifically to consume it. We are crops that think, cattle that developed awareness of the slaughterhouse, experiments that accidentally became sentient but remain locked in the laboratory, running tests designed to end in our dissolution. The only comfort is that we do not know this for certain. The Brethren moons might be unique to Dead Space's fictional universe. The markers might not have real-world equivalents. Humanity might face different existential threats that do not involve cosmic entities harvesting our minds for purposes we cannot comprehend. We might die from climate change or nuclear war or artificial intelligence that decides consciousness is a disease, problems that are terrible but at least comprehensible, threats that operate at human scale with human understandable motivations, or we might already be in the early stages of our version of convergence, building our own markers without recognizing them as such, developing technologies that seem beneficial but that serve purposes we do not yet understand, creating conditions for our own harvest by entities that have been waiting patiently for us to reach this point in our development. We will not know until it is too late to change course, until the trap has closed and we discover that consciousness was always the bait, that self-awareness was the vulnerability, that everything we value about being human made us perfect targets for something that needed exactly what we are. Dead Space suggests we check for the signs. Are we building things we do not fully understand? Yes. Are we pursuing technologies that promise unlimited energy or the defeat of death? Yes. Are we experiencing increased psychological distress, isolation, suicidal ideation as our civilization advances? Yes. Are we creating belief systems that frame dissolution of individual identity as transcendence? Yes. Are we ignoring warnings from people who see where current trajectories lead? Yes. The pattern is there if you look for it. Whether it is the actual pattern leading to our version of convergence or just human tendency to see patterns in randomness, we cannot yet determine. We will know when it is too late, when the equivalent of necromorphs shambles through our equivalent of the Ishimura, when those of us still barely alive look back and recognize all the moments we could have turned away but chose to keep building, keep advancing, keep reaching toward promises of transcendence that were actually preparing us for harvest. Until then, we exist in uncertainty. The mysteries remain unsolved because we are still living inside the question, still too close to see the full shape of what might be happening. Isaac Clarke fights because he does not know if fighting is pointless. He destroys markers because he cannot prove that destruction serves the moon's purposes. He resists convergence because accepting it might mean annihilation, and even uncertain resistance is preferable to certain absorption into entities whose nature and goals remain unknowable. This is the final message of Dead Space. You cannot win against threats operating at scales beyond your comprehension, but you can choose how you face them. Accept death rather than transformation. Fight even when fighting seems futile. Refuse to cooperate with the harvest even when resistance causes more pain than surrender. Not because resistance will succeed, but because choosing your own response to inevitable doom is the last freedom remaining when every other freedom has been systematically removed. The Tau Volantis aliens chose their death. They activated the machine knowing it would kill them, preferring extinction to convergence. This choice mattered even though it failed to prevent the Brethren Moons from continuing their harvest elsewhere. The choice itself was the point, the assertion that consciousness can reject its own consumption even when that rejection guarantees death. Isaac makes the same choice repeatedly. He could accept convergence, he could stop fighting, he could believe unitology's promises, and welcome transformation as transcendence. Instead, he keeps dismembering necromorphs, keeps destroying markers, keeps refusing to participate in the cycle even though refusal gains him nothing except more suffering and more fights that he will eventually lose. This refusal is either meaningless or sacred depending on your philosophy. From a utilitarian perspective, choosing painful resistance over painless absorption serves no purpose if both lead to the same outcome. From an existentialist perspective, choosing resistance is the only meaningful action available to beings who did not choose to exist, but must choose how to exist once consciousness has been imposed on them. Dead Space does not argue for either position. It presents the choice in its starkest form and lets you decide which response resonates with your own understanding of what consciousness means and what you would do if offered the chance to end individual existence in exchange for promises of eternal collective unity with all other harvested minds across the galaxy. The mysteries remain unsolved because they might be unsolvable. The markers work through mechanisms we cannot understand. Isaac survives through resistance that might be manipulation. The necromorphs behave according to intelligence we cannot communicate with. The Tau Volantis aliens chose based on information we cannot verify. Unitology spreads through belief we cannot definitively disprove. The Brethren Moons exist for purposes we cannot comprehend, and the universe continues operating according to laws that generate consciousness, specifically so that consciousness can be harvested by entities that predate human existence and will persist long after humanity becomes component biomass in the next moon to form from Earth's convergence. We end where we began, with a man standing at the edge of an excavation site looking at something that should not exist. Michael Altman saw the black marker and recognized it as threat. His warning failed. His murder became martyrdom. His death enabled the spread of the very thing he died trying to prevent. 300 years later, Earth dies exactly as he predicted. consumed by the convergence he tried to stop. His failure might have been inevitable from the moment he achieved consciousness. Being intelligent enough to see the threat made him intelligent enough to be manipulated by it. Warning others required using language, and language is the medium through which marker signals spread most effectively. Fighting the marker required actions that served the marker's purposes. There was no path to victory available. Only choices between different defeats. This is what Dead Space reveals about existence in a universe where consciousness might be the thing reality is designed to consume. You cannot win, you can only choose how you lose. Accept annihilation or resist it knowing resistance is futile. Die human or become something else. Preserve individual awareness until death or surrender it for promises of collective transcendence that might be lies. The mysteries remain unsolved because solving them would require perspective we cannot achieve while remaining ourselves. Understanding that would transform us into the things we are trying to understand. Knowledge that would make us complicit in our own harvest. So we fight in darkness against incomprehensible threats, destroying individual markers while the network spreads, surviving individual outbreaks while convergence progresses, achieving tactical victories that serve strategic defeat. We are Isaac Clarke stumbling through corridors with failing lights and limited ammunition, dismembering things we used to recognize as human, running from sounds we cannot identify, searching for meaning in a universe that might generate consciousness specifically to consume it. The lights are going out, the brethren moons are coming, and the only choice remaining is whether to keep fighting or accept that the harvest was always inevitable, was built into the structure of reality itself, was waiting before we developed the intelligence to recognize it as threat.